Bay of Biscay, spring, 1943. A German submarine rides the surface in the dark, recharging its batteries, in no particular hurry. Below deck, a dial glows faintly. It's been trained to catch exactly one thing: the pulse of British radar, sweeping in from miles away, giving the crew time to dive and vanish. Tonight it reads nothing. Not a flicker. Not a warning. Then, the sky opens. A searchlight. Engines, and 6 depth charges already falling before anyone below understands what's happening. The receiver never made a sound. That boat wasn't unlucky. It was one of dozens. May 1943. The German U-boat fleet had never been bigger. 240 submarines ready for war, 118 of them out on the Atlantic at once, the largest wolfpack Germany had ever put to sea. By the end of the month, somewhere between 41 and 43 of them were gone. Historians still argue over the exact number. That's how fast the killing happened, and how hard it is to count bodies at the bottom of an ocean. Sailors called it Black May. It was the single worst month the U-boat arm ever suffered, at the exact moment it should have been at its strongest. And every one of those boats went down carrying a receiver built to hear the enemy coming. That receiver wasn't broken. It wasn't jammed, and it wasn't outdated in the way you'd think: patched, upgraded, snuck past. It was listening for a threat that no longer existed in the form it expected. Something else had replaced it entirely. Something the Germans' own top scientists had already decided was impossible to build. The best-equipped force in the U-boat war's entire history was being wiped out by something its own equipment couldn't even register. To understand how, we have to go back to when their system worked perfectly. For 8 months, that receiver had been a genuine miracle. It was called Metox, named for the small Paris firm that built it, and crews nicknamed its wooden cross-shaped antenna the Biscay Cross. Turned by hand, tuned to a wavelength 1.5 meters long, it caught British radar pulses from tens of kilometers out. Long before a plane could see a U-boat, the U-boat could hear the plane. Crash dive, vanish, survive. It worked. It worked so well that in March 1943, German wolfpack sank more than 500,000 tons of Allied shipping in 20 days. The Royal Navy's own official historian later wrote that Britain had never come closer to losing its Atlantic lifeline than in those 3 weeks. This wasn't a fleet on the defensive. This was Germany winning. So when German engineers assured their command that radar at 10 times shorter wavelengths, the kind that could slip past Metox entirely, was physically impossible, nobody had much reason to doubt them. Telefunken's own radar physicist argued the case formally. No transmitter on Earth could generate that kind of power at that frequency. Not couldn't yet. Couldn't, period. German command took the argument seriously enough to shut its own centimetric radar research down. They weren't fools. They were following good physics. It just happened to be physics that was roughly 2.5 years out of date. And by February of 1943, they'd already been handed the proof. A British bomber went down over the Netherlands, carrying a radar set built on exactly the technology their scientists had ruled out. German technicians pulled the wreckage apart and found a device generating power at wavelengths they'd been told didn't exist. They gave it a name, the Rotterdam device, and began trying to understand what they were looking at. The evidence was sitting in a hangar in occupied Holland. The doctrine said it couldn't be real. So the question wasn't whether the impossible thing existed. They were holding it. The question was who had built it in the first place, because whoever it was, they clearly hadn't gotten the memo about what was and wasn't possible. Not a national laboratory. Not an industrial combine, with a blank check from Berlin. 2 researchers, in a physics department at the University of Birmingham, working under a Royal Navy contract that had come with a modest ask: build something that could put out 1 kilowatt of power at 10 centimeters. Their department head handed them the problem, then went back to his own work. He had other things to do. Their names were John Randall and Harry Boot. Neither man ran the department. Neither had the standing of a Wilhelm Runge, the Telefunken physicist who just told the German government, with full institutional authority, that this exact feat couldn't be done. Randall and Boot didn't have a lab full of glassblowers and vacuum specialists. What they had was an old idea, the magnetron. A device already decades old and going nowhere fast, and a stubborn insight about how to fix it. Every existing design sealed its components inside a fragile glass envelope. Randall and Boot threw the glass out. They took a solid block of copper, dense and dull and about the size you could hold in two hands, and drilled 6 cylindrical cavities straight into it, arranged in a ring. Each cavity would ring at its own frequency, the way a bottle hums differently depending on how full it is. Electrons driven by a magnetic field would sweep past those cavities and set them oscillating, and because the whole thing lived inside solid copper instead of glass, the heat had somewhere to go. Nothing to crack. Nothing to melt. It's worth saying plainly, they weren't the first people anywhere to think about a cavity magnetron. Researchers in France, Japan, and the Soviet Union had all poked at pieces of the same idea years earlier. But none of that work had gone anywhere operationally. Randall and Boot were the ones who made it work. On a bench, in a basement, on the 21st of February, 1940. They sealed the cathode ports with wax, pumped the air out, and switched it on. 400 watts. At 9.8 centimeters. 200 times the power anyone had managed at that wavelength before. Nobody threw a party. There was no telegram to Churchill that night. Just 2 men looking at a number on a meter that, according to Germany's leading radar physicist, should not have been possible to produce. A working device on a workbench in Birmingham does not, by itself, win a war at sea. It has to survive the ocean crossing to the people who can build 1,000 of them. It has to become small enough to fit in the nose of an airplane, and reliable enough to fly in weather that would ground most machines, turning a laboratory curiosity into the thing that would hunt U-boats across an entire ocean that took one more desperate gamble. And it started with a suitcase, a hotel room, and a very nervous physicist guarding it with his life. Britain didn't have the factories to build this thing at the scale a war needed. So in September 1940, with London still burning from the Blitz, a British physicist named Edward Bowen carried magnetron number 12 across the Atlantic in a locked metal case. He slept with it under his hotel bed. At one point, a railway porter nearly walked off with it before Bowen could stop him. When he finally opened that case for American engineers in Washington, the device inside was producing roughly 1,000 times more power than the best transmitter the United States had. America's official wartime historian later put it simply, they had carried, in his words, the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. Here's why that cargo mattered so much. Every earlier radar had to use long wavelengths, because nothing could generate real power at short ones. That was the whole German argument. And it had been true. Right up until Randall and Boot's copper block proved otherwise. Inside that block, electrons crossing from a central cathode out toward the anode got twisted by a magnetic field, sweeping past a ring of drilled cavities like a finger circling the rim of a wine glass. Each cavity rang at a frequency set purely by its size. Get the size right, and you get a wavelength of 10 centimeters, at real power, from a device small enough to fit in your hand, small enough, eventually, to fit inside the nose of an airplane. That's what let Coastal Command retire its old radar, the 1.5-meter set Metox had been built to here, and replace it with something built around this same magnetron. They called it ASV Mark III. Metox's antenna kept spinning. Its dial kept reading 0. Not because anything was broken, because the new radar was speaking in a language that receiver had never been built to understand. By early 1943, some German U-boat commanders had started to suspect something was wrong. Losses were climbing in a way Metox couldn't explain. And that's where the story stops being about physics and starts being about a lie. A captured British officer, under interrogation, told his captors something that sounded almost too convenient. That Coastal Command barely used its radar for searching at all. Instead, he said, British aircraft were homing in on Metox's own internal signal, a faint emission every receiver like it naturally gives off, and could detect it from 90 miles out. German technicians checked the claim. Technically, they decided, it was possible, not proven. Possible, and possible was enough. Unwilling to bet the fleet against it, Grand Admiral Karl Dnitz ordered Metox pulled from every boat in August of 1943. It wasn't sabotage exactly. It wasn't code-breaking either. It was one captured man, telling one convenient story. That happened to fit perfectly with a mystery Germany was already desperate to solve. And it worked. German command spent months chasing a threat that didn't exist, while the real one, a radar band their own physicist had sworn was impossible, kept operating completely unbothered. When Germany finally built a receiver that could hear that new band, they called it Naxos. It wasn't ready until the autumn of 1943, and by then it didn't matter. The Allies had already moved on to an even shorter wavelength, 3 centimeters this time, that Naxos couldn't hear either. Germany wasn't just behind. Every time they closed one gap, the ground had already shifted underneath them. Through the summer of 1943, U-boats kept going out, kept getting found, kept not coming back. By the time anyone in the German High Command understood what had actually happened, the wavelength, the deception, all of it, the battle for the Atlantic, was already over. On the 24th of May 1943, Karl Dnitz did something he had never done before. He pulled every U-boat out of the North Atlantic. Not a tactical retreat, a withdrawal from the entire theater he had spent years trying to control. In his memoirs afterward, he put it in 6 words: we had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. He never fully explained how, in those memoirs. He got his chance to try somewhere else, a courtroom in Nuremberg 1946, under oath, with nothing left to protect. And there, Dnitz said something no one had forced out of him. Allied radar, he told the tribunal, was next to the atomic bomb the decisive war-winning invention of the war. Not a factor. Not one piece of the puzzle. Second only to the bomb that ended the war in the Pacific. Winston Churchill said something almost as revealing, from the other side of that same fight. The U-boat threat, he wrote, was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the entire war, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It never took the form of flaring battles or glittering headlines. It came at him as statistics, diagrams, and curves, unknown to the nation, incomprehensible to the public. A war fought, and nearly lost in numbers nobody was watching. The people who generated those numbers rarely got remembered. RAF Coastal Command flew the missions that made all of this possible, the long, cold, radar-guided patrols over empty ocean, night after night, for years. By some accounts, close to 6,000 of them never came home. They sank 212 U-boats. Fighter Command got the fame. Bomber Command got the memorials. Coastal Command got a nickname, the Cinderella Service, because nobody in London thought to take them seriously until they'd already won. Randall and Boot never got a hero's welcome either. 2 men who built the device that broke the U-boat war, working a Royal Navy contract in a physics department, using a drill and a block of copper. Germany's brightest scientists said what they were doing was physically impossible. It wasn't. It just hadn't been done yet. The same idea sits in your kitchen right now. Every microwave oven built since the war runs on a direct descendant of that copper block, cavities tuned to a frequency, electrons twisted by a magnetic field. The exact physics that once found submarines in total darkness, now warming up leftovers on a countertop. Nobody in that basement in Birmingham thought they were winning a war. They thought they were solving a problem somebody else had already given up on. It just turned out the problem was the war.